Hey, I'm Srini, the creator of Maximize Your Output with Mem. In this video, I'll walk you through a simple, efficient four-step process to seamlessly import highlights from Readwise into Mem. So whether you're a productivity enthusiast or just looking to simplify your digital note-taking, this tutorial will make your life a lot easier. So now let's dive in and get those highlights flowing effortlessly into Mem.
What I'm going to show you in this video is a simple four-step process for getting highlights from Readwise into Mem. Now, I did a tutorial on this before where you had to use Evernote as a bridge, but fortunately, there's a much easier way to do this that doesn't rely on having you to put the notes somewhere else and then import them in. So the first thing we have to do is we have to get some essential information. In this case, it's going to be our Readwise API key and our Readwise webhook endpoint. So what is all of that information? If we go over here, what we'll see when we go to the Readwise API page is it has a bunch of different criteria. For example, you can use this Readwise API key to create highlights, but in our case, what we're interested in is exporting them. So this endpoint basically is a URL that tells it these are the things that I want. So I want to use this URL to export the highlights from Mem. You don't have to worry about all of this unless you want to do some more complicated stuff. And you can see here that we have some parameters that are going to matter as well. In our case, it's just going to be updated after, so we'll bring that in as well. But what we want to do here is we want to get this URL and we want to add it to our essential information. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and paste that here so that we have it as our endpoint. The other thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get your Readwise access token. So if you go here, you'll get access to a Readwise access token. And if you press get access token, it will give you access to that token. So I'm just going to go ahead and click that. I'm going to copy this to the dashboard. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put this inside of our Mem here for our demonstration. And we're going to use that when we set up the Zapier automation. Now, if you haven't set up a connection between Mem and Zapier, you will need to do a Mem API key setup as well. And the way you do that is by going over to your profile here. And if you click on Setup Integrations, you will see a thing that allows you to create an API key. And you just click on this, it will give you an option to create an API key. So in this case, because of the fact that I've already connected Mem to Zapier, I don't need to do that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use this information to set up our Zapier automation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Zapier here on the sidebar. So that way we can see all of this happening together. So the very first thing we have to do is we have to schedule when we want the automation to run. And what we do for that is we're going to choose a trigger in Zapier called Schedule by Zapier. The purpose of this is to prevent us from duplicating highlights and only getting in new highlights. So for example, if you capture a bunch of highlights between 10 and 11, we only want the highlights that you captured after 10 o'clock. And same thing again when it runs at 11 o'clock. So you can set this to be whatever you want. You can set it to be hourly. You can set it to be daily. You can set it to be weekly. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to set it up to be every single hour. And so what we have to do now is we have to say, okay, it's going to trigger on the weekends. Yes, we want that as well. And then what it's going to do is it's going to give us a specific date and time here. For example, I'm recording this at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time, but you can see here it's subtracted. So what we want to do is we want to get any highlights that came in after 10:38 a.m. On this particular day of the week. So that's our schedule. Now, the next part we have to do is we have to set up getting the information from Readwise into Zapier. And for here, what you're going to use is something called a webhook. Now, you will need a premium Zapier subscription to do this. So if you want to do this, you'll have to upgrade your Zapier account from the free one to the premium one, which costs about $20 a month. But if you're setting up a lot of automation, it's totally worth it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fill in this information here. So the first thing we need is we're going to need a webhook, which is our URL endpoint right here, which we got from that essential information. The other thing that we're going to want to do is we want a query parameter. In this case, we only want to use updated after. So we only want notes that were updated after this specific time. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in our query parameter here, and you have to be really careful about how you type this in. You have to match it exactly to the syntax that Readwise uses. So if you look here, you'll see that it's written in a very specific way where the U is lowercase and the A is capitalized, and it's all one word. Because if you screw that up, Readwise won't know what you're talking about. So what we have to do then is we have to insert data. So we want to say, okay, it's updated after this specific time at which the Zap ran. So basically, this is what allows Zapier to know that, hey, I only want highlights that were brought in after a certain time. Now, finally, the last thing we have to do is to actually put in our authorization token. And that's what our API key was for. But you have to also do this in a very specific way. So for headers, what you're going to do is you're going to type authorization, which basically tells the Zap that I'm authorizing you. And then what you're going to do is you're going to give it the value. And you have to type it as token and then enter the actual number for the API key. So let's go ahead and do that. And what this should do is actually retrieve any highlights that were brought in after that specific time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put this information here. And now you'll see here that what we're telling Readwise is that we want you to bring in any highlights that were updated after 10:38 a.m. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to test this. Now it's possible if you haven't updated anything in that time, it will return nothing. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to bring in a highlight using Readwise with my iPhone. I'm just going to capture a highlight for something. And so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to find a podcast and I'm going to save it to Readwise. And so what I'm going to do now is if I retest this step, what we should see is we now get this highlight. So this is great, but what happens if you have lots of highlights? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in one more just to show you how to deal with this. So we're going to go ahead and bring in one additional highlight. So what we're going to do is we're going to retest this so that we end up with two highlights instead of one. And so what you should see now is the second highlight that I brought in. So now comes the part that's a little bit complicated, but not too bad. So let's go ahead and fit this to our view here. This is where you have to set up the looping step. And why do we set up a looping step? The loop is designed to process multiple results from multiple outputs. So we're going to choose create loop from line items. And what we want to do here is we want to basically take whatever values we have inside of Zapier that we want to bring into Mem. So in my case, what do we know that we want to bring in? I know within the highlights, I want the author. So what we'll do is we'll just call this one author and we'll basically assign this to author here. So what you're doing here is you're basically giving it a key, which is called the input key, and then you're giving each key a value. And so now what we need to do is we're going to get another one called text. And so here, what we want to do is get the actual text from the highlight. So you can see here, it brings us results text. The reason you have to do this looping is what will happen is when you try to use this data in the next step, it groups everything together, but you don't want everything grouped together into one mem because you want to import each one of these into mem as an individual node. So the final thing we might want to do is we might want to either get our source URL. So in this case, I like to just use source URL. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pick our source URL here. And if you just do a search for URL, you can see here, it gives you a couple of different things. So this is going to be a very simple setup. You can make this much more complicated in terms of how you want to format it or how you want it to look. But for the sake of our video here, we're just going to do the simplest possible setup. So now what we've got is a setup here that tells Zapier to loop through all of the results from Readwise and group them accordingly. So what we should get here in terms of the output when we test this is 3 different sets. And you can see here, so we've got loop iteration 1 and loop iteration 2. So what ends up happening is we can actually use the specific values for each loop iteration when we create our mem inside of mem. So the next thing we're going to do here is we're just going to take this, and what I want to do is take the data that we got from that step, and I want to import that data into mem to create a new note from my Readwise highlights. So I'm going to choose my note here. This is where you might need the API key if you haven't set up Zapier yet, if you want to be able to pull that information in. So what we want to do here is we want to bring in our various loop iterations here. So what we're going to choose is basically, okay, we want text, and all you have to do is worry about bringing in what information that you want to bring in here. You don't have to worry about actually setting up anything else because the loop will take care of that. So in this case, what we want is we want our text, we want our author, and we want our source URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just title this note sample Readwise import. For demo. And then I'm just going to select all of the information that we brought in. So I'm going to select the text. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically say, okay, we want the author of this text. So I'm going to say author. Now, keep in mind, because of the fact that mem uses Markdown, if you want this to be specifically known as author, what you might want to do here is bold this with a sort of text in front of it that just says authored, and put 2 asterisks around the author word, and then it will assign that specific text to the word author. So then you'd end up getting this as a bullet. If you wanted it to be a bullet, you can actually put a little dash in front of it. In this case, we're just going to bring it in as text. And let's just do the same thing for source. So what I'm going to do is, just like I did with author, I'm going to call this source. I'm going to bold it. And then what I'm going to do for source is I'm going to put in our source URL. So what will happen now is this will then create a note using whatever highlights were imported within the last hour. So I'm going to put a little space here just so we have some space inside of the mem. And if I continue with this, what it'll do is it will take the first highlight and it will create a mem. So we should see that land here in just a second. And there is the note that we just imported. So you can see here, it has the author, it has the source, it has the transcript. Now, keep in mind, there are a lot of things you can do here. For example, if you wanted to use this as the title of the note, you can write some scripts to fix that. But we're not going to do that in this demo because it's beyond the scope of this demo. But in a nutshell, you've seen the basic steps for how to import highlights from Readwise into mem pretty effortlessly. So let's recap exactly what steps were involved in putting this together so that you can easily replicate it. So the first thing you're going to need to do is to gather 3 essential pieces of information. The first is your Readwise API key. The second is the webhook endpoint, which is always pretty much going to be the same. It's just this URL right here. And if you need to connect mem to Zapier, you're going to need your API key for mem. Then what you're going to do is you are going to set up a schedule by Zapier, and then you're going to create a webhook with all the data that we have here. You're going to tell it when you want it to run, what time you want it to be updated after, and then enter in the authorization information. And the most important step in this to make this work is the loop, because of the fact that otherwise you won't get all the highlights. So this way you can accommodate multiple highlights. Even if you highlight 10 different things within an hour, it will still create new notes from each individual highlight. If you don't put in the loop, what will end up happening is you'll get everything as just one big blob of text, which isn't exactly useful. And then finally, just as you would with any other creating mem automation, what you'll do is you will use the output from step 3 and turn it into your output here. And then you'll end up getting your notes imported into mem. And that, in a nutshell, is the easiest way to take highlights from Readwise and import them into mem. And if you want to set it up this way, it probably would take you no more than about 5 minutes. If you want to do some complicated formatting stuff or change the formatting, you might need to write some scripts. That can take a little bit longer, but overall, it's not that complicated. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below.